On the 2nd of October 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire, anxiety gripped the chambers of the Duchess of York. Cecily Neville was giving birth to another child, and the labor proved agonizing. When the infant finally entered the world, the midwives exchanged worried glances. The boy was frail, smaller than his brothers and sisters, and it seemed he would not survive. He was named Richard, after his father, Richard Plantagenet, the third Duke of York. The newborn became the penultimate of 12 children in a family where every child was a piece in a grand political game. At that time, England stood on the threshold of a monumental upheaval that would later be known as the Wars of the Roses. Richard Plantagenet, the infant's father, was one of the kingdom's most influential magnates. His lineage traced back to King Edward III, which gave him claims to the English throne. However, the royal crown rested on the head of Henry VI of the House of Lancaster, whose power was waning with each passing year. The king was a pious but weak-willed man, incapable of governing the state during a crisis. Intrigues were woven around the throne, and a conflict was brewing in the country between two branches of the royal house: the Yorks, whose emblem was a white rose, and the Lancastrians, with their red rose. Little Richard was born into a family that was preparing for a war for the throne. The childhood of the future king passed in an atmosphere of constant danger. When the boy was only 3 years old, his father openly opposed the crown, demanding reforms and influence over the government. The conflict escalated into an armed confrontation. In 1459, at the Battle of Ludford Bridge, the Duke of York suffered defeat and fled to Ireland. Little Richard remained with his mother and younger siblings in London, where the family found themselves effectively in the position of hostages. The boy grew up surrounded by rumors of military campaigns, betrayals, and executions. He saw his mother worry about his older brothers, who had left for the war with their father. Tragedy struck the family in December 1460. At the Battle of Wakefield, the Yorkist army was routed by the forces of Queen Margaret of Anjou, who effectively ruled in place of her sick husband. The Duke of York perished in the battle, and his head, crowned with a paper crown in mockery of his claims to the throne, was displayed on the gates of York. With him fell the second son of the Duke, 17-year-old Edmund, Earl of Rutland. 8-year-old Richard was left without a father. The head of the family was now his older brother Edward, Earl of March, who had turned 18. It was he who had to avenge the death of his father and brother and continue the fight for the throne. Edward proved to be a brilliant commander. He was tall, handsome, and charismatic. He inspired his supporters and knew how to win. As early as March 1461, he won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest battle of the war. Henry VI fled to the north, and then to Scotland. Edward entered London as a victor and was proclaimed King Edward IV. For little Richard, this meant a complete change of fate. From the son of a rebellious duke, he turned into a prince of the blood, the king's brother. He was granted the title of Duke of Gloucester, one of the most honorable in the kingdom. The war seemed to have ended with the victory of the Yorks, and a bright future lay ahead. However, peace proved short-lived. The Lancastrians were not going to give up. The north of England remained their stronghold, and from there, raids were regularly carried out against royal troops. Young Richard spent several years away from his brother in the safety of Yorkist allied castles. His upbringing was handled by experienced mentors who prepared the boy for the role of a prince and a military commander. Richard studied horsemanship, fencing, and the command of troops. He studied Latin, history, and the foundations of law. Despite his frail health in infancy, the boy grew up strong and resolute. He strove with all his heart to prove his loyalty to his brother and family, to show himself a worthy son of the fallen Duke of York. In 1464, Edward IV shocked the court by announcing a secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, the widow of a Lancastrian knight. This marriage became a political disaster. The king was supposed to marry a French princess to strengthen England's international position, but instead chose an impoverished noblewoman. Moreover, Elizabeth had a multitude of relatives who immediately began occupying lucrative positions at court and receiving titles. This caused outrage among the old nobility, including the kingdom's most powerful baron, Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, nicknamed the Kingmaker. It was Warwick who helped Edward ascend the throne, and now he felt betrayed. Richard of Gloucester watched as a new conflict brewed at court, threatening to destroy all the Yorkists' achievements. The Earl of Warwick did not hide his dissatisfaction with the king's policy. The powerful baron, who owned vast lands and commanded numerous armed detachments, was accustomed to influencing the monarch's decision. Now, however, Edward IV listened increasingly to the advice of his wife's relatives, the Woodville family. The Queen actively promoted her brothers and sons from her first marriage to advantageous posts, distributing lands and titles. The old aristocracy saw this as a threat to their position. Richard of Gloucester, who had turned 16, faced a choice. Warwick was the husband of his cousin and one of his late father's closest allies. But Edward was his brother and his king. In 1469, Warwick openly rebelled against the king. He was supported by the middle brother of the royal family, George, Duke of Clarence, who had married Warwick's daughter and dreamed of taking the throne himself. The rebel army took the king prisoner. Edward IV was imprisoned in one of Warwick's castles in the north of England. Richard of Gloucester did not join the uprising. He remained loyal to his brother, although many expected the young duke to follow the example of Clarence. This loyalty determined his entire future. When the king managed to escape a few months later thanks to the support of remaining loyal barons, Edward did not forget who had stood by him in the difficult hour. Warwick fled to France, where he concluded an incredible alliance with Queen Margaret of Anjou, the very woman he had fought against while helping the Yorks take the throne. The Kingmaker decided to restore Henry VI of the House of Lancaster to the throne. In exchange for support, Margaret agreed to marry her daughter to Warwick's youngest son. It was a daring plan, and it nearly succeeded. In the autumn of 1470, Warwick landed in England with an army. Edward IV, caught by surprise, fled to Burgundy. Henry VI was taken out of the Tower, where he had spent 5 years of imprisonment, and proclaimed king once again. Richard of Gloucester followed his brother into exile. The 18-year-old youth found himself in a foreign land, stripped of titles and lands, with an uncertain future. The exile lasted only a few months, but for Richard, these were months of maturing. He saw his brother not in royal majesty, but in the position of a fugitive, forced to beg for help from foreign rulers. Edward IV turned to the Duke of Burgundy, his brother-in-law, and received a small army for an invasion of England. In the spring of 1471, the brothers landed on the coast of Yorkshire. Initially, their army was small, but Edward possessed an amazing ability to attract supporters. He promised forgiveness to those who would switch to his side, offering rewards and lands. Gradually, barons disappointed in the rule of the restored Lancastrians began to join him. Even George of Clarence, who had betrayed his brother for an alliance with Warwick, returned to Edward and received forgiveness. On the 14th of April, 1471, the Battle of Barnet took place north of London. Edward's troops clashed with Warwick's army in a thick morning fog. The battle was fierce and bloody. Richard of Gloucester commanded the vanguard of the royal army. It was his strike that proved decisive. Warwick's army wavered and fled. The Kingmaker himself fell in battle, struck down by the swords of Edward's soldiers. This was Richard's first major victory as a commander, and it showed that the young duke had inherited his older brother's military talent. However, the war was not yet over. Queen Margaret had landed in England with a new army and was moving to link up with Welsh Lancastrian supporters. On May 4, the armies met at Tewkesbury. The battle again ended in a Yorkist victory. The son of Margaret of Anjou, Prince Edward, the only Lancastrian heir, died in the battle or was executed immediately after it. The Queen herself was taken prisoner. A few days later, King Henry VI died in the Tower under mysterious circumstances. It was officially announced that he died of grief upon learning of his son's death, but everyone understood that the old king had been killed on Edward's orders. Richard of Gloucester did not participate in this murder directly, but he knew of it and did not protest. At 19, he already understood the harsh laws of the struggle for power. Living claimants to the throne would always be a source of rebellion. The House of Lancaster was destroyed, and it seemed that the Yorks had finally gained firm power. After the victory, Richard was generously rewarded by his brother. Edward IV appointed him governor of the north of England, a region that had always been a Lancastrian stronghold. The young duke was to pacify this rebellious territory and turn it into a reliable pillar for the crown. Richard also received vast landholdings taken from the defeated rebels. Among them were the estates of the Earl of Warwick, whose daughter, Anne Neville, became Richard's wife. This marriage was not only a political union but also a true affection. Anne and Richard had known each other since childhood, and their union proved strong. Their marriage was happy, and soon they began expecting a child. Richard had found the family and position he could only have dreamed of during the years of war and exile. York, an ancient city with Roman walls and a Gothic cathedral, became the residence of Richard of Gloucester. From there, he governed the vast northern territories, from the border with Scotland to the central counties. The task was not easy. The north of England had always been characterized by a special spirit. The local barons prided themselves on their independence and were reluctant to submit to royal power. Many of them had supported the Lancastrians for generations and viewed the Yorkist appointee with suspicion. Richard had to win their trust, prove himself a just and strong ruler, and he succeeded. Unlike many courtiers who saw appointments to the periphery as punishment, Richard came to love the North and dedicated more than 10 years of his life to it. The Duke personally sorted out legal disputes, accepted complaints from common people, and ensured compliance with the law. He did not tolerate corruption or the abuse of power by local officials. When he received information about abuses, he acted quickly and decisively. The guilty were punished regardless of their origin or connection. This policy earned Richard popularity among the townspeople and peasants, who saw in him a defender against the arbitrariness of the nobility. Northerners began calling him Good Duke Richard and a true ruler. He built churches in the region, supported monasteries, and patronized trade. Under him, York thrived, becoming the second most important city in the kingdom after London. Richard's military talents also found application. The Scottish border remained restless. Scottish detachments regularly raided English lands, looting villages and stealing cattle. Richard organized a system of border defense, creating a network of fortified castles and observation posts. He personally led punitive expeditions against the Scots, demonstrating bravery and tactical skill. In 1480, a full-scale war with Scotland began. Edward IV entrusted his younger brother with the command of the invasion army. Richard handled the task brilliantly. His troops captured the important fortress of Berwick and devastated the south of Scotland, forcing the Scots to sue for peace. However, Richard's relationship with the royal court in London was becoming increasingly strained. Edward IV was sinking into luxury and pleasure. The handsome king, famous for his military victories in his youth, now preferred feasts, hunting, and mistresses to state affairs. He grew stout and squandered a significant part of the treasury on entertainment and expensive gifts for his favorite. Governance of the country effectively passed into the hands of the Woodville family, the Queen's relatives. They surrounded Edward with a tight circle, controlling access to the monarch and distributing positions among their own people. Richard saw how the authority of the crown was being undermined, how the dissatisfaction of the nobility was growing every year, but he was far from the capital and could not influence the situation. Especially painful for Richard was the case of his brother George, Duke of Clarence. Clarence never reconciled with the fact that the crown belonged to his older brother, not him. He participated in conspiracies, spread rumors about the illegality of Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, and accused the king of tyranny. In 1478, Edward's patience snapped. Clarence was arrested on charges of high treason and imprisoned in the Tower. Parliament found him guilty and sentenced him to death. On the 18th of February, 1478, Clarence was executed in his cell. According to one version, he was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine, the Duke's favorite drink. It was a dark irony of fate. Richard had tried to save his brother. He begged the king to pardon Clarence, reminding him of their blood ties, of how the three of them had survived wars and exile. But Edward was adamant. Behind the king stood the Woodvilles, who saw Clarence as a dangerous enemy. They insisted on execution, and Edward yielded. For Richard, George's death became a personal tragedy and a warning. He understood that even blood ties did not protect against political reprisal, that there was no place for sentimentality in the struggle for power. The relationship between Richard and the royal court grew cold. The Duke spent more time in the north, avoiding trips to London. He immersed himself in the management of his lands, the upbringing of his son, and military affairs on the Scottish border. It seemed to him that this way he could avoid court intrigues and live a quiet life as a faithful vassal and the king's governor. In 1476, Richard and Anne had a son, Edward, nicknamed of Middleham after his birthplace in Middleham Castle. The boy was frail and sickly, but his parents doted on him. Richard saw his son as a successor to the line, the future Lord of the North. He dreamed of passing on everything he had built during the years of governing this region: stability, prosperity, and the respect of the population. The Duke could not know that fate was preparing a completely different future for him, and that in a few years his life would turn so much that he would not recognize himself in the mirror of history. On the 9th of April, 1483, King Edward IV passed away suddenly at Westminster Palace. He was only 40, but years of excess had undermined his health. The king had fallen ill at the end of March after returning from a fishing trip, and his condition deteriorated rapidly. Court physicians proved powerless. According to one version, Edward died of pneumonia. According to another, of a stroke caused by obesity and an immoderate lifestyle. Before his death, the king managed to write a will in which he appointed Richard of Gloucester as protector of the kingdom and guardian of his underage children. The heir to the throne was 12-year-old Prince Edward, the eldest son of the late monarch. But the boy was in Ludlow, on the border with Wales, under the supervision of his uncle on his mother's side, Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. The news of his brother's death caught Richard in York. The Duke immediately ordered a requiem mass in the cathedral and commanded all of the north to swear allegiance to the new king, Edward V. Then he gathered a small detachment and set off for London. The journey would be long, several days of riding along spring roads. Richard reflected on the future. He knew the Woodvilles would try to remove him from power. Queen Elizabeth and her numerous relatives saw him as a threat to their influence over the young king. They had effectively ruled the country for the last few years, and they did not need a strong protector who could limit their power. Richard understood that a struggle lay ahead, but he was confident in his right. The late king's will appointed him guardian of the heir, and he intended to carry out his brother's wishes. On April 29, Richard met young Edward V in the town of Stony Stratford, halfway between Ludlow and London. With the boy king rode Earl Rivers and other representatives of the Woodville family. The meeting began with mutual greetings and assurances of loyalty. Richard knelt before his nephew and swore allegiance, but by night everything had changed. The Duke arrested Rivers and the other royal companions, accusing them of a conspiracy against the crown. Richard's men surrounded the house where the royal escort had stopped and captured the leaders of the Woodvilles. Young Edward was faced with a fait accompli. From now on, his uncle Richard would take care of his safety and would accompany him to London. The boy tried to protest, wept, and demanded the release of his men, but he had no choice. The entire Woodville entourage was shaken as they reached London. Queen Elizabeth, learning of what had happened, realized her family was in danger. She gathered her younger children and sought refuge in Westminster Abbey, invoking the right of sanctuary. Along with her, the late king's second son, 9-year-old Prince Richard, Duke of York, also moved into the abbey. The city filled with rumors and anxiety. Some said that Gloucester had saved the king from a Woodville conspiracy, as they had wanted to remove the legal protector and seize power. Others whispered that Richard himself had plotted a usurpation, that he had arrested loyal servants of the crown and was now holding the underage monarch effectively as a prisoner. The truth lay somewhere in between. Richard was indeed afraid that the Woodvilles would push him away from power, but his actions went further than simple self-defense. On May 4, Richard entered London in triumph at the head of a procession, in the center of which rode young Edward V. The Duke tried to turn this event into a demonstration of the legitimacy of his position. He ordered carts filled with weapons allegedly captured from the Woodville conspirators to be carried at the head of the procession to show the townspeople the reality of the threat. The young king was placed in the Tower, the royal residence where monarchs traditionally lived prior to their coronation. Richard announced that the coronation would take place on June 22 and began preparations for the ceremony. Outwardly, everything looked normal. The protector governed the state in the name of the underage king, convened the Council of Lords, and began reviewing current affairs. But a different drama was unfolding behind the scene. Richard understood that his position was fragile. The Woodvilles were alive, even if they were under arrest. The Queen Mother enjoyed sanctuary in the abbey and could become a center of resistance. The young king was growing up and would sooner or later want to rule independently. Then, the first thing he would do would be to punish those who had arrested and, likely, executed his favorite maternal uncles. Richard recalled the fate of his brother Clarence, executed by order of Edward IV. He did not want to repeat that fate. Furthermore, rumors began reaching Richard that could change everything. Courtiers whispered that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was illegal, that before marrying her, the king had already been betrothed to another woman. If this were true, then the children from the marriage with Elizabeth were bastards and had no right to the throne. These rumors were spread by Bishop of Bath, Robert Stillington, who claimed he was personally present at a secret betrothal of Edward IV to Lady Eleanor Butler before the war. According to the laws of that time, a betrothal concluded before a priest had the force of marriage. If Edward had truly been betrothed to Eleanor, then his subsequent marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, and their children were illegitimate. Eleanor Butler herself had died in 1468, and it was impossible to verify these claims. But for Richard, this rumor was a gift of fate. If the children of Edward IV were recognized as bastards, then the legal heir to the throne would be he himself, the younger brother of the late king. Only one question remained. Would Richard dare to take such a step? June 1483 turned out to be tense. London lived in expectation of Edward V's coronation, but the atmosphere in the city was uneasy. Richard of Gloucester strengthened his position by enlisting the support of key figures in the kingdom. He met with lords, bishops, and commanders of the royal guard. The Duke gave promises, hinted at future rewards, and sometimes openly threatened those who hesitated. On June 13, an event occurred that finally showed the true intentions of the protector. During a meeting of the King's Council in the Tower, Richard suddenly accused several lords of a conspiracy against his life. The main target was William Hastings, Lord Chamberlain, one of the closest friends of the late Edward IV. Hastings was devoted to the memory of the king and did not intend to support the usurpation. He spoke openly that Edward's children were legitimate and that Edward V should be crowned as soon as possible. This made him a dangerous opponent for Richard. At the council meeting, Gloucester suddenly stood up, struck the table with his fist, and screamed that Hastings and other traitors were plotting his murder using witchcraft. He demonstratively rolled up his sleeve, showing an allegedly shriveled arm which, according to him, had withered due to magical curses. Hastings tried to object, but the doors swung open, and armed men burst into the hall. Richard ordered the Lord Chamberlain to be taken out to the courtyard immediately and beheaded. A few minutes later, Hastings' head lay on the scaffold. Other members of the council, stunned by what had happened, hurried to assure Richard of their loyalty. This murder showed that Gloucester was ready for anything for the sake of power. He had removed the main obstacle on his path, intimidating the remaining potential opponents. The next step was gaining control over the younger prince. Richard demanded that the Queen Mother hand over the 9-year-old Duke of York to him from sanctuary. Elizabeth refused, but increasing pressure was put on her. The Archbishop of Canterbury personally went to Westminster Abbey to convince the Queen to yield. He assured her that the boy was in no danger, that his older brother missed him in the Tower, and that they would be preparing for the coronation together. Finally, exhausted and terrified, Elizabeth gave up. On June 16, the younger prince was delivered to the Tower to his brother. Now, both sons of Edward IV were under Richard's full control. On June 22, the day of the appointed coronation, Richard convened a meeting of London's nobility and merchant class. Instead of a coronation ceremony for the young king, a sensational statement was announced to the citizen. A preacher named Ralph Shaw, the brother of the Lord Mayor of London, delivered a speech in which he claimed that the children of Edward IV were illegitimate. He referred to the testimony of Bishop Stillington about the late king's secret betrothal to Eleanor Butler. Shaw stated that Edward's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid and their children had no right to the throne. Moreover, the preacher hinted that Edward IV himself was an illegitimate son, the fruit of his mother's, the Duchess of York, marital infidelity. This claim was particularly cynical, considering that Cecily Neville, the mother of Edward and Richard, was still alive and present in London. Shaw's speech was met with silence. Londoners did not know how to react. Some believed the accusation. Some understood it was merely a pretext for seizing power, but speaking out loud was dangerous. A few days later, a similar statement was presented to Parliament. The Lords and members of the House of Commons heard the arguments about the illegitimacy of Edward IV's children. The vote was a formality. Everyone understood that Richard had troops, controlled the Tower, and would stop at nothing. On June 25, Parliament adopted a document titled Titulus Regius, the royal title, which declared Edward IV's children bastards and proclaimed Richard of Gloucester the rightful king of England under the name Richard III. The next day, June 26, Richard formally agreed to accept the crown. This acceptance was a carefully staged ceremony where a delegation of lords solemnly requested the Duke to become king to save the kingdom from chaos. On the 6th of July 1483, Richard III was crowned in Westminster Abbey. The ceremony was magnificent and solemn. The new king wanted to demonstrate the legitimacy of his power, to show that he was not a usurper but a lawful monarch chosen by Parliament and blessed by the Church. Beside him was crowned his wife, Anne Neville, who became Queen of England. Their son Edward received the title of Prince of Wales, heir to the throne. For Richard, this was a moment of triumph. He had reached what he could not have even dreamed of a few months earlier. The younger son of the Duke of York, who had spent his childhood in the shadow of his older brothers, now wore the crown of England. But this triumph was overshadowed by a terrible crime that Richard had already committed or was planning to commit. Young Edward V and his younger brother, Prince Richard, remained in the Tower. At first, they were seen in the courtyard of the fortress, where the boys played and engaged in physical exercise. But gradually their public appearances became rarer. By the end of July, the princes had disappeared from view entirely. Rumors about their fate began to spread through London. Some said the boys had been sent to one of the remote castles. Others whispered something more terrible, that the princes were dead, killed by the king's order. Richard himself remained silent. He did not explain where his nephews were, did not show them to the people, and did not deny the rumors. This silence was more eloquent than any word. Public opinion began to turn against the new king. Even those who initially supported him now looked at Richard with suspicion and fear. The fate of the princes in the Tower became one of the darkest mysteries of English history. Richard III's contemporaries were certain that the boys were killed by the king's order in the summer or autumn of 1483. The young Prince Edward's personal physician, John Argentine, left England shortly after Richard's coronation and later stated that the prince had confessed to him like a man preparing for death. This testimony was taken as confirmation that the young Edward knew of his impending fate. According to the most common version, which was later presented by Thomas More in his History of Richard III, the king entrusted the murder to his loyal servant, Sir James Tyrrell. According to More's account, Tyrrell received a special order from the king and the keys to the tower. One night, he crept into the prince's chambers along with two assistants, a groom named Miles Forrest and a jailer named John Dighton. The boys were sleeping in one bed, clinging to each other. The murderers threw pillows over them and smothered them until the princes stopped breathing. Then the bodies were temporarily buried at the foot of a staircase in the tower and were later moved to a more worthy place by a priest. Tyrrell allegedly confessed to the crime later, but the text of his confession was never published, which casts doubt on the authenticity of this story. Nevertheless, the fact remains. Two boy princes disappeared, and Richard did nothing to dispel the suspicion of their murder. In 1674, during the reconstruction of the tower, workers found a wooden box containing the bones of two children under the staircase of the White Tower. The remains were considered to belong to the princes, and King Charles II ordered them to be buried with honors in Westminster Abbey. In the 20th century, these bones were studied by scientists who confirmed that they belonged to two boys of about the same age as the princes in 1483. However, it is impossible to establish definitively that these were indeed the remains of Edward IV's sons without DNA analysis, for which the Church does not grant permission. The secret remains unsolved, but in the eyes of Richard's contemporaries, the guilt was obvious. The murder of the princes, if it indeed happened, was a politically senseless and morally monstrous crime. Richard was already king. The children had been declared bastards and stripped of their rights to the throne. They posed no real threat to him, especially while under guard. But Richard may have thought otherwise. He remembered how long the Wars of the Roses had lasted, how every surviving claimant became a banner for rebels. Henry VI was killed in the Tower to prevent a Lancastrian uprising. Prince Edward, Henry's son, had fallen at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Richard's brother, Clarence, had been executed on suspicion of conspiracy. In this logic, the death of the two boys was simply one more step in an endless chain of political murders. But for the people, this step went too far. Rumors of the prince's murder caused a wave of indignation. Richard tried to strengthen his power by touring the kingdom. In the summer and autumn of 1483, he visited many cities, accepted the oaths of local lords, and demonstrated himself as a just and strong ruler. He was welcomed especially warmly in the north, in York, where Richard was well known and remembered for his years as governor. But in other parts of the country, the attitude was restrained or even hostile. People looked at the king with suspicion, seeing in him a murderer and a usurper. Richard felt this distrust and tried to compensate for it with active efforts. The new king began to implement reforms. He streamlined legal proceedings, making them more accessible to ordinary people. Richard banned the practice of benevolences, forced contributions that a king could demand from his subjects under the guise of voluntary gifts. This practice had been one of the most hated during Edward IV's reign, and its abolition brought Richard popularity among the merchants and townspeople. He also introduced protectionist measures in trade, shielding English merchants from foreign competition. These reforms showed that Richard was not only a military commander but also a competent administrator who cared about the well-being of the kingdom. But all his efforts could not erase the stain of suspicion surrounding the murder of his nephew. In October 1483, an uprising against Richard broke out. It was led by the king's former ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, one of the kingdom's most powerful magnates. Buckingham was the one who had actively supported Richard in his seizure of power, helping him remove Edward V and gain the crown. But now he had risen against his former friend. The reasons for the uprising remain unclear, Perhaps Buckingham was outraged by the murder of the princes, or perhaps he himself had counted on more power and rewards that he did not receive. The mutiny was poorly organized and quickly suppressed. Heavy rains prevented Buckingham's troops from linking up with other rebels. The Duke's army scattered, and he himself was captured while trying to flee. On November 2, Buckingham was beheaded in Salisbury. Richard did not delay the execution of the traitor. The Buckingham uprising was suppressed, but it showed that Richard III's power was shaky. Even more alarming was that the rebels proclaimed as their pretender to the throne a man who, until then, had played almost no role in English politics, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Henry had been living in exile in Brittany for 12 years, from the moment his uncle brought him there as a boy after the final defeat of the Lancastrian. His rights to the English throne were weak and originated through the female line from John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. Moreover, Henry's ancestors on this line were illegitimate, although later legitimized. Under normal circumstances, Tudor would have had no chance at the crown, but circumstances had ceased to be normal. Henry Tudor was the last representative of the Lancastrian line who could oppose the York. After the death of Henry VI and his son, after the destruction of other possible claimants, Tudor remained the only alternative to Richard for those who did not accept the usurpation. The organizers of Buckingham's uprising invited Henry to return to England and lead the fight against Richard. They promised him the support not only of the remnants of the Lancastrians but also of many Yorkists outraged by the murder of the princes. The culmination of this plan was to be the marriage of Henry to Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. This marriage would have united in one person the rights of both warring dynasties and put an end to the Wars of the Roses. The idea was attractive and dangerous to Richard at the same time. Henry attempted to land in England in October 1483 but was late. When his ships approached the English coast, Buckingham's uprising had already been crushed. Tudor, seeing Richard's army on the shore, prudently turned his ships around and returned to Brittany. But he did not abandon his plan. In exile, a coalition of Richard's opponents began to form around him. English immigrants who had fled after the failure of the uprising joined Henry. Among them were noble lords, experienced military commanders, people who knew England and could help in a future invasion. Tudor also received financial support from the King of France, who was interested in weakening England through a civil war. Richard understood the threat posed by Tudor. He tried to organize the kidnapping or assassination of the pretender, sent agents to Brittany, and negotiated with the Duke of Brittany for Henry's extradition. For a while, these efforts nearly succeeded. The Duke of Brittany, having fallen severely ill, agreed to hand over the English exile to Richard, but Henry, warned by friends, managed to escape to France, where he received sanctuary at the court of the young King Charles VIII. The French not only accepted Tudor but also began actively preparing him for an invasion of England. It was profitable for them to install on the English throne a man who would owe them the crown and, consequently, be more compliant in political affairs. Meanwhile, in England, Richard's situation was complicated by personal tragedies. In April 1484, his only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, Prince of Wales, died. The boy was about 10 years old and had been sickly from birth, but his death was a terrible blow to his parents. Richard and Anne doted on their son, seeing in him the successor to the dynasty. Now the king had no direct heir. By the law of succession, the crown was to pass to his nephew, the son of his late brother Clarence. But this boy was held in confinement and was considered incapacitated due to his father's treason. Richard announced another nephew, the Earl of Lincoln, the son of his sister, as his heir, but everyone understood that this was a temporary solution, and Richard's dynasty was hanging by a thread. On the 16th of March, 1485, a year after his son's death, Queen Anne passed away. She was only 28. It was officially stated that she died of consumption, which had been slowly destroying her health for the last few years. But many contemporaries believed that the real cause was grief over her late son. Anne had never recovered from this loss. For Richard, his wife's death was not only a personal grief but a political problem. Without a wife and direct heirs, his dynastic prospects looked grim. Moreover, immediately after Anne's death, ominous rumors began to crawl through London. It was said that Richard had poisoned his wife himself to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of Edward IV. This marriage would have strengthened his position, uniting both branches of the dynasty in his person and depriving Henry Tudor of his main trump card, the opportunity to marry Elizabeth and thereby claim the throne. The rumors were so persistent that Richard was forced to refute them publicly. In the presence of London authorities and the nobility, the king swore that he had never contemplated marriage with his niece, and that such a union would be contrary to church laws against incest. This public renunciation showed how shaky the king's reputation had become. Even the most incredible accusations found listeners ready to believe them. Throughout the spring and summer of 1485, Richard prepared for the inevitable invasion by Tudor. He gathered troops, strengthened coastal defenses, and sent out orders to his vassals to keep their men in readiness. The king knew that Henry was receiving support from France and that an invasion was only a matter of time. Richard did not fear a military confrontation. He was an experienced commander who had won many victories. He had a large army, loyal commanders, and control over the royal castles and arsenals. Tudor, on the other hand, was an exile who had spent most of his life abroad and had no military experience. In a fair battle, Richard was confident of victory. But there had been no fair battles in the Wars of the Roses for a long time. On the 1st of August 1485, Henry Tudor's fleet left the French port of Honfleur. On board the ships were about 2,000 soldiers, predominantly French and Scottish mercenaries, as well as several hundred English immigrants. It was a small army for the conquest of a kingdom, but Henry was counting not on numbers but on support within England. His supporters promised that many lords would rise against Richard as soon as the pretender set foot on English soil. On August 7, Tudor's ships entered the harbor of Milford Haven in southwestern Wales. The landing proceeded without resistance. Local authorities did not obstruct the invasion, and many Welshmen even welcomed Henry as a compatriot. His grandfather on his father's side had been a Welsh nobleman. News of Tudor's landing reached Richard in Nottingham, where the king was with his army. Richard immediately sent out orders for the assembly of all royal forces. He called upon his vassals to fulfill their feudal duty and arrive with armed detachments to protect the lawful king from a rebel. Most responded to the call. Richard's army began to converge toward the center of the country, preparing to intercept Tudor's forces on their way to London. Among those who promised support to the king were the Stanley brothers, Thomas, Lord Stanley, and his brother, Sir William. They commanded significant forces in northwestern England. However, Richard did not fully trust them. Thomas Stanley's wife, Lady Margaret Beaufort, was Henry Tudor's mother, and the king suspected that the Stanleys might betray him at the decisive moment. Henry Tudor moved through Wales to the east, toward the border with England. Welsh detachments, attracted by promises of rewards and lands, gradually joined him, but the main allies, the English lords, were nowhere to be seen. Many hesitated and waited, not wishing to risk their lives until the outcome of the struggle was determined. Henry's path lay through sparsely populated lands where it was difficult to replenish food supplies and find fresh recruits. The situation appeared desperate. Tudor had fewer than 5,000 men, while Richard's army, by various estimates, numbered from 10,000 to 15,000. Furthermore, Richard had artillery, experienced knights, and better weaponry, but Henry continued to move forward, believing in the promises of his secret ally. On August 21, the armies met near the village of Bosworth in Leicestershire. Richard positioned his troops on Ambion Hill, occupying a favorable position. His army was drawn up in 3 battle lines: the vanguard under the command of the Duke of Norfolk, the main forces led by the king himself, and the reserve under the nominal command of the Earl of Northumberland. On the flanks, at some distance, stood the detachments of the Stanley brothers, who were formally obligated to support the king but had not yet moved. Henry Tudor positioned his smaller army down in the valley. He understood that in a head-on collision he would lose. His only hope lay in treason within the enemy's rank. On the morning of August 22, the battle began. Richard's vanguard, under the command of the Duke of Norfolk, attacked Tudor's positions. A fierce hand-to-hand fight ensued. Henry's French and Scottish mercenaries fought desperately, knowing there was nowhere to retreat. Norfolk was killed in the skirmish. His troops began to press the enemy. Victory seemed near for Richard, but the king noticed that the Stanley detachments were not moving to support his troops. They stood aside, observing the battle. Richard realized he had been betrayed. In a rage, he sent a messenger to Thomas Stanley with a threat to execute his son, who was held hostage by the king, immediately if Stanley did not enter the fight. Lord Stanley coldly replied that he had other sons. Then Richard made a decision that determined the outcome of the battle and his own fate. He saw in the valley, behind the line of fighting troops, a small detachment under the personal banner of Henry Tudor. The pretender was there with a small escort, away from the main body of his army. For Richard, this was a chance to end the war with one blow. If he killed Henry, his army would scatter, and the rebellion would be suppressed. The king gathered about 80 knights of his personal guard and led them in a desperate charge straight across the battlefield toward Tudor's position. It was a reckless, but typical act for the chivalric era. Richard preferred personal bravery to cautious tactics. The cavalry charge of Richard was fierce and unexpected. The king, in full armor with the crown on his helmet, rode in front of his knights, hacking through the ranks of the enemy. He personally killed William Brandon, Henry Tudor's standard-bearer, casting the royal banner into the dust. Then the king engaged in a duel with an experienced knight, John Cheney, a huge man known for his strength, and unhorsed him as well. Richard was just a few meters from Henry himself. Another moment, and he would have reached his target. But at that moment, the troops of William Stanley entered the battle. Sir William decided to support Tudor and struck Richard's troops from the flank. 3,000 fresh soldiers fell upon the small detachment of royal knights. Richard's men were surrounded, cut off from the main army. Advisors begged the king to retreat while there was still time, while the way for retreat was still open. They offered him a horse for escape, but Richard refused. According to the Chronicle, he uttered the words that Shakespeare would later make famous: "I will not think of flight. I shall be king or perish." He continued to fight, surrounded by enemies on all sides. The fight was short but extremely brutal. Richard fought like a lion. His sword cut through armor and flesh. But the numerical superiority was too great. Blows rained down on the king from all sides. Research on his remains, found centuries later, showed that Richard received multiple wounds. 2 terrible blows to the head pierced his helmet and skull. One blow was dealt with a halberd, another with a sword or spear. These wounds were fatal. Moreover, traces of 8 more wounds were discovered on the skeleton, including in the back, which indicates that Richard was attacked from behind when he was already wounded and possibly lying on the ground. One of the blows to the base of the skull literally impaled the king's head. Richard III fell in the thick of the battle on the 22nd of August 1485. He was 32 years old, and he had ruled England for only 2 years and 2 months. With his death, the battle ended. The king's army, seeing Richard's demise, took flight. The reserve troops of the Earl of Northumberland did not even enter the battle. They also betrayed the king, remaining on the sidelines during the decisive struggle. Richard's crown, which had fallen from his helmet in the battle, was found in a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head right on the battlefield. Thus began the rule of the Tudor dynasty, which would reign in England for 118 years. The body of the murdered king was treated with the greatest contempt. It was stripped naked, slung across the back of a horse, and brought to Leicester in this manner. Crowds of townspeople came out to look at the fallen monarch. Some spat at the corpse, others looked on in silence. For 2 days, the body remained on public display in the church of St. Mary de Castro so that no one would doubt that Richard was truly dead. Then the king was buried without honors in a Franciscan monastery known as Greyfriars. The grave was simple, without a monument or a tombstone. The new dynasty did not want to create a site of pilgrimage for those who might honor the memory of the last Yorkist. Henry VII, as Tudor became known after his coronation, immediately began rewriting history. His propagandists depicted Richard III as a monster, a hunchback tyrant, and a child killer who had received his just desert. By an act of parliament, the document Titulus Regius, which proclaimed Richard the rightful king, was destroyed. All copies were subject to burning under pain of punishment. History was being rewritten by the victor. Richard became the villain of Tudor historiography, an image that solidified over centuries, thanks to William Shakespeare's play Richard III, written more than a century later when the granddaughter of Henry VII, Queen Elizabeth I, sat on the throne. The Greyfriars Monastery was destroyed in 1538 during the Reformation, when Henry VIII, grandson of the victor at Bosworth, dissolved all monasteries in England. Richard's grave was lost. According to legend, his remains were thrown into the River Soar, which flows through Leicester. For centuries, the grave of the last Plantagenet was considered lost forever. The site of the former monastery was built over, and the memory of the exact location of the burial faded. Centuries passed, and the story of Richard III turned into a myth where truth and fiction were so closely intertwined that separating one from the other seemed impossible. On the 25th of August, 2012, 527 years after the Battle of Bosworth, a group of archaeologists began excavations in a municipal parking lot in the center of Leicester. This site was located on the territory where the Greyfriars Monastery once stood. The excavation was organized by the Richard III Society, a group of enthusiast historians who had spent decades trying to rehabilitate the reputation of the last king from the House of York and find his remains. Many were skeptical of this endeavor. The chances of finding a 500-year-old burial under the asphalt of a modern city seemed negligible. But on the very first day of the excavation, an archaeologist's shovel struck human bones. The skeleton lay in a hastily dug pit, too short for the body. The legs were bent to fit into the grave. This indicated a burial without proper ceremony. The skeleton's spine had a pronounced scoliotic curvature. The person had suffered from severe curvature of the back in his lifetime. The skull bore marks of multiple injuries, including 2 devastating blows that had pierced the bones and penetrated deep into the brain. These were fatal wounds received in battle. Other damage was found on the bones, including humiliating post-mortem insults blows delivered to an already dead body. All of this coincided strikingly with historical accounts of Richard III's burial, but the archaeologists needed irrefutable evidence. Genetic studies began. Scientists extracted DNA from the bones and compared it with the DNA of living descendants of Richard III's sister through the female line. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down only through the maternal line, showed a virtually 100% match. This was scientific confirmation. The skeleton under the parking lot in Leicester indeed belonged to the last king of the Plantagenets. Radiocarbon analysis dated the remains to the second half of the 15th century, which also corresponded to the time of Richard's life. The discovery became a sensation on a global scale. Examination of Richard's remains gave scientists a unique opportunity to verify historical accounts of his appearance. The famous hunchback of Richard, described by Tudor propagandists and immortalized by Shakespeare, proved to be an exaggeration. The king indeed had scoliosis, a lateral curvature of the spine, which could have made one shoulder higher than the other, but it was not the ugly hump from the legend. In life, wearing specially fitted armor and clothing, Richard could have hidden his deformity. Many contemporaries who described his appearance before his ascension to the throne did not mention any physical flaws at all. The curvature could have been unnoticeable or, at least, not as pronounced as the Tudor propaganda claimed. A facial reconstruction of Richard from the skull showed a man with thin features, a straight nose, and quite young for his 32 years. He was not the monster from Shakespeare's play, but an ordinary medieval king, a warrior, and a ruler of his epoch. Analysis of the wounds confirmed that Richard fell in a fierce fight, struggling until his last breath. The blows were dealt with great force by weapons characteristic of the end of the 15th century, halberds, swords, battle axes. Some of the wounds on the skull could only have been dealt after Richard's helmet had been removed, which suggests that he was being finished off when he was already wounded or dead. This corresponded to accounts of how the king's body was desecrated after the battle. On the 26th of March 2015, Richard III was reburied, this time with royal honor. The coffin with his remains was solemnly carried through the streets of Leicester and placed in the city's cathedral. Thousands of people came to bid farewell to the king whose death had occurred more than 500 years ago. The ceremony was both a funeral and an act of historical justice. Richard, who died as a villain and was buried as a criminal, had finally found a worthy resting place. A simple slab of Yorkshire stone was placed over his grave, with an engraved cross and the inscription Richard III, 1452, 1485. The story of Richard III remains a subject of dispute. Was he a ruthless usurper and child killer as the Tudors portrayed him, or was he a capable ruler who fell victim to political struggle and a subsequent smear campaign? Historical facts allow us to see a complex picture. Richard did indeed seize power, removing the lawful child king. He almost certainly bears responsibility for the death of the princes in the Tower, although there is no direct proof of this. But he was also a competent administrator who carried out reasonable reforms and enjoyed popularity in the north of England. He fought bravely and died as a warrior, not wishing to flee. The discovery of Richard's remains did not resolve all disputes about his personality, but it returned a human dimension to a legendary figure. The skeleton with the curved spine and multiple wounds reminded us that behind the myth stood a real person who lived, loved, fought, and died in a cruel era, an era when the crown was won by the sword, and royal blood guaranteed neither safety nor a long life. Richard was the last English king to fall on the battlefield. With his death, not only did the Plantagenet dynasty, which had ruled for 330 years, come to an end, but also an entire era of medieval England. The Battle of Bosworth is traditionally considered the boundary between the Middle Ages and the early modern period in English history. The grave in Leicester Cathedral has become a place of pilgrimage for historians, tourists, and everyone interested in this dramatic period. Arguments about Richard continue, but now they are conducted not only on the pages of books, but also over the real burial place of a man whose life and death changed the course of English history. It took 500 years for the last Plantagenet to find peace, and although history cannot be rewritten, the memory of him has become more just, cleansed of the most egregious distortions of Tudor propaganda. Richard III remains a mystery and a tragedy, a figure who simultaneously repels and attracts, forcing each new generation to reevaluate his deeds and his era.